The international emblem of workers' power burned by a people for whom the red flag is a symbol of Russian imperialism. Tbilisi is the ancient capital of the mountainous Soviet Republic of Georgia. This was a colony which hoped to benefit from the revolution in Russia. Independence Day for Georgia came on the 26th of May 1918.
Of
course, I rushed to the town center straight away, caught my breath and looked around. The whole town had spilled out into the streets. Everybody had heard that today was the day they were to declare Georgia independent. The streets were teeming with people. Children were running everywhere, singing, playing games. It was such a celebration. We'd got our independence back at last.
In May 1919, independent Georgia celebrated the first anniversary of the national government. Their freedom was short-lived. Sergo Orjonikidze was a Georgian. He was also a Bolshevik. In 1921, he brought communism to Georgia at gunpoint. Orjonikidze marched into his homeland on the orders of another Georgian, the Bolshevik Commissar for Nationalities, Joseph Stalin. Summer 1918, 8 months since the Bolsheviks seized power, a Congress of Soviets met at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. The proceedings were interrupted by the Socialist Revolutionary Party attempting a coup. The coup defeated, delegates returned to approve the formation of the Russian Soviet Socialist Federative Republic. An emblem was proposed, hammer, sickle and sword, for workers, peasants and soldiers. Lenin rejected it, too warlike. Congress chose a plain hammer and sickle, a symbol of unity for a state which was far from secure.
The government were finding life rather difficult. The civil servants and teachers wouldn't work with them. The bank clerks went on strike. Lenin sent a telegram to Sweden. Urgently find and send 3 highly skilled accountants to work on reform of the banks. But it was the treaty with the Germans which made people really angry.
The German army took control of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. The Bolsheviks had kept their promise to pull Russia out of the First World War, but the Germans exacted a ferocious price in losses of territory. To many Russian patriots, the Treaty of 1918 was a terrible humiliation. The River Don, South Russia. This is where the Cossacks come from. The village of Starocherkassk was built by people who fled south hundreds of years ago to escape persecution or to flee the law. The Cossacks served as the elite mounted troops of all the Romanov Tsars. They were legendary for their valor, cruelty, horsemanship, and music. The Don Cossacks were among the first to mount an organized military resistance to Soviet power.
We were shocked. We couldn't understand how Russia could live if there was no Tsar. We found material in a military store and leather to make boots, and we all became shoemakers. We were very well dressed. Crimson caps we had, red on top with a blue band, crimson caps. And the letter D for Dostoevsky. That was our newly formed Russian fighting force. The counter-revolution had begun.
Leon Trotsky got the job of countering the counter-revolution. As Commissar for War, Trotsky began to recruit a new kind of army. It was called the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army.
When we created the Red Army, we didn't have any commanders of our own. There were non-commissioned officers, those in charge of small units, but proper trained officers we just didn't have any, and no time to wait. Naturally, the senior officers we did have were as a rule the sons of noblemen or of the bourgeoisie. They had their own ideas, not in tune with Soviet power. So when we invited officers to join us, we simultaneously established a system of control over them. The Commissar's orders were to keep an eye on them, to help them, of course, and to try to learn something from them. In the party, we used to say that the Commissar is the eyes and the ears of the party inside the Red Army.
Inside the party, employing officers from the old Imperial Army was highly controversial. The Red Army did away with the title officer. Senior men were called commanders instead. This was an unconventional army. Trotsky's men received watches instead of medals. The new Red Army was preparing to face civil war.
Right from the start of the Civil War, 1918, they killed all the officers they took prisoner. They shot some of them, took a revolver and just shot them, finished them off. Or they nailed epaulettes into men with nails this size. Or they cut their medals off them, gouged out their chests. I saw a man left dead like that myself. I saw officers who'd been hung on a windmill. You know those windmills that go round and round? They were just hanging there.
The whites were equally merciless. These white guards were filmed in charge of Bolshevik prisoners. "7 million people would die in 3 years of civil war. Into all this came a foreign intervention. At the great Russian ports from Murmansk to Vladivostok, anti-Bolshevik forces put ashore. There was still a world war on. Russia's former allies were furious with the Bolsheviks for pulling out of the conflict. Troops came from America, France, Italy, Japan, and Britain. The British sent a force to Azerbaijan in the south, hoping to safeguard the oil fields and ports of the Black Sea and the Caspian. In Moscow, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were trying to hold together a new and inexperienced government, trying to run the country in accordance with their revolutionary ideals. They sent agitation trains thousands of miles to spread the word about their policies: nationalization, freer divorce, workers' power. They brought the alphabet up to date and promised a mass literacy campaign. And they changed their name from Bolshevik to Communist. Then suddenly they lost the trains. The entire Trans-Siberian Railway fell to a legion of hostile Czechoslovaks. The Czechs fell in with the Whites, and the enemy came dangerously close to the town of Ekaterinburg. Too close to its valuable prisoners, the Tsar had been in Bolshevik custody for more than a year. Now Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were held in Ekaterinburg, inside the House of Special Purpose. They were taken into the cellar and shot.
Well, the assassination of the Tsar passed practically unnoticed. There were so many other things, and nobody, news was so confused. You know how they don't give you news now. I mean, it was all, you never saw anything in the papers about it. It was just rumors. We didn't know for sure whether he'd been assassinated or not. And anyway, there were other things that people worried about. The main one, of course, to get food and so on. So it passed unnoticed practically.
Lenin was the target of an assassin's bullet that summer too, victim of a terrorist campaign. This film is possibly the world's first ever political photo opportunity, organized to prove that Lenin had survived.
Suddenly we heard that Lenin had been shot by a terrorist and that he was badly wounded. They brought him to the Kremlin, where we were on guard at the time. How do you think we all felt? It was our job to guard Lenin, and suddenly he's been seriously wounded.
The would-be assassin was Fania Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary. Her party's campaign resulted in several communist funerals. Death to the bourgeoisie, mourners demanded, and revenge in the form of the Red Terror.
There was no sentimentality about the Red Terror. We were to go as far as shooting our enemies, killing all those who opposed Soviet power. And so we killed them. The whole operation was very well organized by the Extraordinary Commission.
The statue is of Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Speculation and Sabotage, the Cheka, Hammer of the Revolution, he called it. The first Soviet secret police set up in the Anker and Lloyd's Insurance Building in Lubyanka Square. In their first 4 years, they announced 12,733 executions. They're still here today, but now they're called the KGB.
The threat to Soviet power from the new white armies began to overshadow domestic problems. Equipped by the Allies, manned by volunteers and conscripts, the whites were ready to fight.
We'd gone on 100 meters and then drop. The nearer you got, the fiercer the firing from the Bolsheviks. You go on already so close, and then the command rings out, line up, forward. And that's the point. You feel so heavy, you can't raise your head, can't lift a finger. But in the end, we'd get there and smash the Bolsheviks.
Trotsky's army was no easy target. He ran it with an iron discipline from his mobile headquarters aboard a specially equipped train. In the course of the war, Trotsky's train covered 60,000 miles as he traveled the distant fronts, whipping up morale. The men who fought in the Red Army were expected to buy their own food from villagers. It wasn't easy.
Nobody wanted our money in the countryside. They all wanted money issued under the Tsar, in case the Tsar came back. Then they'd have the right money. We got supplies in the end. We'd get a supply of salted herrings, but no bread to go with it. So we'd have to eat salted herrings on their own. You soon get thirsty. You lie down by a puddle to drink, and there's a little frog sitting there, staring at you.
Away from the front line, communist propaganda pushed home the message. This cartoon was shown in makeshift cinemas. Posters depicted Lenin sweeping the world clean of class enemies. Trotsky is a red St. George exterminating the dragon of counter-revolution. Communism, a red wedge driving into victory over the forces of white reaction.
Reds versus whites in an ideological fight to the finish? Well, it may have looked like that to the top ranks, but these were hungry and desperate years. Men fought for whoever would feed them. Whole units changed sides, from red to white and back again, or even set up on their own. It was a time of chaos and misery.
The roads of Russia were clogged with refugees driven from their homes, families split up, children who'd lost their parents. The job of looking after them fell to the communist women's section.
And all the women from the women's brigade, we had to feed them, wash them, delouse them. Discipline in the party at the time was very strict. It was a revolutionary discipline. We called anybody who grumbled spoilers. The others, people who didn't agree with Soviet power, who couldn't adjust, we snubbed them, shouted at them for not believing. You see, you had to believe in the shining future the Bolsheviks were leading us to.
In that cruel year of 1919, the shining future seemed very distant. As Lenin buried his brother-in-law, hope of revolution elsewhere in Europe was dying. The Russian Revolution appeared isolated and vulnerable. The Whites had their headquarters far to the east along the Trans-Siberian Railway. They looked effective, organized, and highly menacing, but appearances were deceptive. Even as they showed off their red prisoners for the cameras, the White cause was faltering. Corruption and unpopularity assailed their leader, Admiral Kolchak, who called himself the supreme ruler. Kolchak was never as strong as he looked.
The situation in Siberia was very confused. There was never any proper Bolshevik government and, in fact, any Kolchak government. The great majority of little towns and villages were so-called Greens. That is, they opposed both the communists and the Kolchak armies. Generally speaking, we wanted to be left in peace.
The trap door slowly opened. You know those Russian houses with cellars running underneath. And someone appeared. Oh, they said, they could see we were whites from our epaulets and everything. Oh, our saviors, our deliverers. Here, here, have some cucumbers, some cabbage. But later on, when we were forced to retreat, the same people shot us in the back.
Even the foreign intervention was not as much help to the Whites as they had hoped. Organizations like the American Red Cross sent supplies, but Allied aid often ended up helping the wrong side, like one red soldier who lost his boots.
I ended up fighting barefoot. It's awful marching through woods like that, all prickly, feet covered in blood. But what can you do? Later we got our hands on one of Admiral Kolchak's stores, stuff he got from England.
Его снабжала Англия, English. Такие здоровенные ботинки.
There were boots there, such good boots, strong, thick soles, hobnails and huge sizes. One of your soldiers must have been even taller than me.
И вот тут-то я достал до четырех.
That's how I got my boots. It was the happiest day of my life. Thank heavens, no more fighting barefoot.
The The Reds borrowed ideas as well as boots from their white enemies. Old-fashioned mounted units like these white Cossack horsemen were out of favor among military theorists, but they were fast, cheap, and terrifying. So the Reds set up their own cavalry army.
Partisan units started first, and then the party took over control of organizing it. We had a slogan, workers to horse. We got hold of horses and saddles and gradually began to build up our own cavalry units. The commander was Budyonny.
And so your humble servant joined the cavalry. When you go into an attack, I used to be in the infantry. We had to charge with our bayonets. It was terrifying. Even now I still shiver to think of it. But in a cavalry attack you can feel another living thing beneath you, the horse. And somehow that keeps you calm. And if it's a good horse, then you can catch up with an opponent, and if you don't get in there first, you'll get cut down.
The Red Cavalry was formidable and glamorous. It became the enduring image of Red victory. By the summer of 1920, the Whites were in retreat. Delegates from all over the world came to Russia for the Third Communist International. There were now a host of small communist parties to congratulate Lenin on what was still the only successful socialist revolution. The star speaker was Trotsky.
The leader of the Red Army, the creator, in fact, of the Red Army, the conqueror of Kolchak, and he was a splendid speaker. I remember very vividly how he came once. We had a parade, and he came and talked to us, and we were all very young, and we were all very hungry. And this speech somehow influenced us very much, and I can only say that Trotsky was our idol. We are prepared to die for him.
The Red Army Trotsky created now numbered over 5 million men. Most of the white generals were dead or evacuated overseas. Only one remained, the Cossack general Wrangel, nicknamed the Black Baron. Wrangel commanded the last of the white forces. They were in the south. With them were thousands of civilians. They were hurrying towards the Crimea and the safety of a massive waterborne evacuation to Turkey. On the 4th anniversary of the October Revolution, in weather so cold the men had to stuff their shirts with moss, the last battle began.
At Perikop, there were terrible battles. 30,000 lay dead, all Reds. They'd attacked us day and night, non-stop. Non-stop. 30,000 they lost. We had no forces left anymore. All our strength was gone. Our troops wavered and fell back towards the Crimea.
I would like to make a comparison with Dunkirk. Of course, the ships were overloaded. There were a great number of people, the army and civilians had to be evacuated. And the ships, some of the ships were listing. Our ships particularly was listing. The water was just, as we pulled out, the water was just going a bit over the decks.
But there were no panic, there were no stress. One could feel, even as a child, I felt that there was tension. But there was no hysterical outcries. Only thing was emotional feeling that we are leaving Russia and we are leaving for something unknown.
We were standing on the quay. They'd stopped boarding people because the ship was so overloaded. As we stood there, a boat passed by, a minesweeper. Yes, it was a minesweeper. It was flying a big St. Andrew's flag, and on deck stood General Wrangel. The boat was moving very slowly, and General Wrangel was shouting through a horn. He was saying, "The time has come to evacuate. We're leaving for foreign lands. Nobody knows what awaits us. But anyone who wishes to stay, I bear them no grudges. I know myself how hard it is to leave your homeland." The minesweeper passed by, and we shouted, "Hurrah!"
George Novikov was one of 150,000 people General Wrangel evacuated from the Crimea. The Cossack cemetery in Paris is the last resting place of a lost cause. George Novikov came to France as an exile. In Russia, the Reds had dealt the Whites a decisive defeat. For the rest of the empire, the battles were still to come. The Kronstadt naval base near Leningrad. In the spring of 1921, sailors mutinied. Their rebellion was crushed in a bloody and traumatic encounter. After Kronstadt, Russia became a true one-party state. The Civil War was over. People tried to rebuild their lives, but the economy was in tatters. Flyaway inflation meant money was worthless. In the cities, the working class disappeared as people went home to their villages. The Kronstadt revolt would become a powerful expression of this popular discontent.
Oh, 1920 Moscow. People were starving, snow everywhere, the trams had stopped. Rationing had been brought in for all the workers and office workers. Everybody would go off to work in the morning, dragging little sledges. On the way back, they were loaded with wood chips, fuel for their stoves. They had little iron stoves with pipes, which they poked through the window. It was so cold.
So one day I was getting the snow out to boil the kettle, and I found a coal, and it was frozen coal. So I brought it back, and my sister and I decided that if she plucked it, she knew how to pluck. If she plucked it and dressed it up properly, we could probably let it be, say that it was a chicken and sell it that way. And so I took it to the market. It had been powdered, it had been dressed up. The coal looked marvelous. And some commissar's wife gave me quite a lot of stuff for it. She gave me half a pound of lard and about 10 pounds of potatoes. I bargained like anything. So that was the way we lived.
To keep the cities from starving, iron detachments of party activists arrived in the countryside. They'd changed their party's name from Bolshevik to Communist. So the Bolsheviks, who promised land to the peasants, were now communists, taking their food by force. The villages did not submit without a struggle.
There were times of real hunger. All our food had gone. Anybody who had any grain left hid it away in the wood. They'd found out that grain requisitioning had already got to neighboring villages. So the men built a little hut in the woods nearby. They collected all the food we had left, all the grain, and hid it there in the little hut.
The peasants were confused. At first the Bolsheviks hadn't seemed too bad. But these communists with their requisitioning gangs were nothing but thieves and tyrants. The countryside resisted, at first with flails and pitchforks, later as real armies. The civil war had ended, the peasant war was just beginning.
Thousands of party people were set upon and killed by roaming bands of vengeful peasants. Lenin said, "We are barely holding on."
Every Saturday and Sunday we were out on grain requisitions, searching out stores of food. The local party representative had set out to meet us when he was ambushed. They killed him, stole all his papers, and let his horse go. The horse turned up carrying his dead body.
Years of war and requisitioning, then a terrible drought. This train evacuated 400 starving children from the Volga. These were the lucky ones. The famine killed 5 million. At Kronstadt, the sailors thought their revolution had been betrayed. This was the reason for the celebrated mutiny of 1921. They called for free speech and more democracy. Their demand, all power to the Soviets to rescue the Soviets from Communist Party control. They were armed and powerful. It was Trotsky, leader of the Red Army, who took the decision to attack the island fortress. He sent in the Civil War hero Tukhachevsky. Red soldiers went into battle against Red sailors. Their task was daunting.
It was already spring. The ice was beginning to melt. The water came up to our knees. But it was much worse for the infantry, who had to march ahead. The ice was melting, and in front of my very eyes, I can still picture it now, an entire unit of men just disappeared beneath the ice. And after a bloody battle, we finally took Kronstadt.
To the Red soldiers who crossed the ice, the sailors were guilty of unforgivable treachery. This film depicts heroic defenders of the revolution.
Life was like that. Today a comrade, tomorrow a traitor to the revolution. I've only ever had sympathy for people loyal to Soviet power. I had never sympathized with people who opposed it. Never.
This was the flash which lit up reality better than anything else. That was Lenin's reaction to Kronstadt. His response was a political clampdown. All other parties were banned. Inside his own party, dissident factions were outlawed. But he transformed his economic ideas. He used his personal authority to force through a controversial new economic policy. Food markets reopened as free trade was legalized and the peasants appeared in town to sell their produce. The new economic policy, or NEP, was a welcome release from ration cards and requisitioning. But to many communists, NEP brought back the bad old days.
You could buy everything. They sold anything you wanted. There was sausage, boiled, fried, steamed. Maybe it was even dog meat. I don't know. We used to watch all the bourgeoisie, the ladies sailing by, showing off. There were tables put out for them in the park, a small park, the Hermitage it was called. It's still here in Moscow. People would gather there in the evening, play music, have a bit to drink.
There wasn't a scrap of food in the country. We were down to a quarter pound of bread per person. Then, suddenly they announced NEP. Cafes started opening, restaurants. Factories went back into private hands. It was capitalism. The papers were all quoting Lenin. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's all very well, but in my eyes, what was happening was the very thing I'd struggled against.
It was just like perestroika. People don't understand now either. They have their doubts. Wonder, do we need it? But in those days, the situation was even more acute. I can remember the years 1921, 1922. We used to discuss the new economic policy for hours on end at party meetings. Most people supported Lenin. Others said he was wrong. Many even tore up their party cards.
И тоже люди сбросали партийные билеты, многие.
NEP was a sensible response to Lenin's economic difficulties. It didn't owe much to Karl Marx. According to him, socialism simply couldn't apply to a backward economy like Russia's. In any case, the revolution had to be international. Marx gave no clues about what to do if you found yourself all on your own trying out socialism in one poor, backward, chaotic country.
And the empire was one country again. Tbilisi, capital of Georgia, 1,000 miles from Moscow on the other side of the Caucasus Mountains. Joined the Russian Empire in 1801, left it in 1918. Brought back in by force in 1921. During its brief period of independence, Georgia was run by a left-wing coalition. A delegation of leading Western socialists came on a visit to see the first elected socialist government in the world. Crowds turned out to hear Ramsay MacDonald, the British Labour leader. The British Army was here too, this Indian force among the last remainders of the foreign intervention. Expensive and ineffective, the intervention was abandoned. As the British fleet sailed away from Georgia, a small army of local volunteers was left to defend the country's independence.
Everybody was queuing to join up. Anybody who could use a rifle was enrolled as a soldier and sent off to the front. As I remember, about 300 people were killed just in the vicinity of one village alone. Our troops were cut off by the Reds and our army was forced to retreat.
I got up one morning, went out, and there they were. Red soldiers on horseback in those sort of tall helmets, riding along our street. And that was that. The town was quiet, peaceful, orderly. The soldiers had been told to leave the local people alone. All the terror and all that came later.
Joseph Stalin was the man responsible for sending the Red Army into his homeland. This is his mugshot from the Tsarist police files. As a non-Russian, he seemed the perfect choice for the job of Commissar for Nationalities in the Soviet government. In the summer of 1921, after the fighting was over, the Commissar for Nationalities came home to Georgia and addressed a meeting. Shalva Chantladze was there.
Some of the workers there got up and said, "We don't agree with you. We don't agree because we were running a political struggle here," they said. But all this killing and attacking our former comrades, the Social Democrats who set up the government here, well, we can't do that. Comrades sitting close by could see that Stalin was angry and spiteful. He said, "We made a bad job of turning Georgia over. We'll have to turn her over again."
The communists were all in favor of national self-determination, but they were more in favor of workers' power. In its name, Soviet rule was enforced in Georgia. The local party boss, Philip Maharadze, led the celebrations. He unveiled a victory statue of Lenin. But the Georgian communists found their comrades from Moscow high-handed and arrogant. Maharadze appealed to Lenin for support. By the time Trotsky took the salute at the parade marking the 5th anniversary of Soviet power, the arguments were heated. Lenin wasn't there to celebrate. He was too ill after a stroke, but he had a pile of letters from Georgia complaining about Stalin's behavior. At the Bolshoi Theatre, there were many nationalities among the delegates who arrived to hear Stalin speak at a historic Congress of Soviets. It was December 1922.
Everybody had come in their national costume. They were all prepared to set up a federation. There were about 1,200 people there. They'd come from Belarusia, the Ukraine, from the 3 states in the Caucasus. We decided to take a vote. Stalin gave a speech that everybody was for joining together within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
The foundation of the USSR recreated an empire almost the same as the one the Tsars had ruled. For Lenin, it should have been the summit of his life's work, but he was a sick man. And it's clear from his writings that he was worried.
The complete works of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, all 10 million words of them. One of his last letters was to the protesting Bolsheviks of Georgia. "Dear comrades, in this affair I am entirely on your side. I'm horrified at Orjonikidze's arrogance and Stalin's criminal alliance with him. Thus Lenin declared war on bullying, bureaucracy and chauvinism. It was far too late."
I got there and found all my party comrades already gathered. Some sort of secretary appeared. He seemed very upset about something. We all thought it was because he was ill. He went out, but after a couple of minutes he came back in. He said, "Comrades," and fell silent. There were tears in his eyes. We didn't understand anything until finally he said it. Lenin is dead. We were so shaken by it, we couldn't speak. Just sat there, couldn't move from the room. Somehow we knew that at that moment we all needed each other.
Lenin suffered a third and final stroke at his country house on the 21st of January 1924. Hundreds of local people accompanied his coffin as it began the journey to Moscow. He was loved, he was hated. But he had towered over the country he left behind. At the trade union house in Moscow, Lenin lay in state. The mourners included his sister Ulyanova, his widow Krupskaya, his secret police chief Dzerzhinsky, his general secretary Stalin. The entire party leadership confronting the question what to do now with the country they had inherited.
It was such bitter weather. Everybody froze, but they still queued to pay their last respects to Lenin. That's how much they loved this man, this leader. Ordinary, honest people, peasants, workers, intellectuals. They were all wiping the tears from their eyes as they lined up at Trade Union House to file past the coffin of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. It never occurred to me that anybody could take Lenin's place. There was a slogan printed in the papers: Lenin can only be replaced by the collective will of the party.
All this began on the very day the old leader died. Busts of Lenin, inkwells in the shape of his mausoleum, Lenin's face on cigarette packets. It got so out of hand that the Immortalization Commission stepped in with licenses to control the Lenin souvenir industry. It was the Immortalization Commission, too, which put his embalmed body on public display, the relic of an atheist saint. Lenin would have hated it, but every Soviet leader since has claimed to be acting in his name.
More than anything, we were frightened of Trotsky seizing power. Although now we know that that wasn't the main problem. In those days, Stalin was an unknown figure to us. People hadn't heard of him. I worked in the Kremlin, and I didn't know who Stalin was. And I was a Red Commander.
In Soviet Georgia, people remember one last outburst of nationalist feeling. A socialist uprising in the summer following Lenin's death, bloodily suppressed by the secret police. Hundreds were held in this cellar in the mountain town of Telavi.
From what I can gather, that night they planned to execute 100 people. The prisoners were all undressed, made to stand in their underwear. After the execution, the bodies were thrown onto horse-drawn carts, just piled up. They were taken to a place called Gigo Hills. As the carts moved off, blood was dripping on the road. They left a trail of blood behind them. My father was head of investigation in the local police. 3 days before, he'd been relieved of his duties and arrested. That was on the Thursday. By the following Tuesday, he'd been executed. He was shot here, in that building. How did we find out he'd been shot? They just put a list up on the wall. That's how we found out.
When you chop wood, chips fly. One of Stalin's favorite sayings. Soviet people of all nationalities would soon learn what Georgians knew already. The lesson that blood must be spilt to drive a people along the road towards the shining future. That for Joseph Stalin, their country's famous son, the end would always justify the means.